Why do footballers like Lionel Messi earn in millions while essential workers like even doctors who save lives earn far lesser? Economics explains this through the concept of labor markets. I can assure you one thing. In the future, whether you're going to be an employer or an employee, this concept is going to affect all of us. Hi friends, welcome to Econverse. I am Abrar and I'm a fellow student who topped in my GCSE Economics last year in Oman. In this channel, we make learning economics simpler, clearer and hopefully a lot more fun. In this video, we're going to be looking at the most important concept in my opinion, labor markets. So let's get started. We are going to be looking at labor markets. So whenever we look at labor markets, I think it's important to understand exactly what labor is. Labor, for anybody who goes to work, is basically someone who goes to work. That is the simple definition of labor. So we all know what labor means. This could be some of our parents, it could be our father, our mother, or any one of our relatives. So whenever we look at labor, I think it's important to understand what determines someone's choice of occupation, or what really determines someone's desire to go and work. So whenever you look at someone's choice of work, they're essentially divided by two main factors. Firstly, you have your wage factors, and secondly, you have your non-wage factors. So let us try and look at some wage factors and non-wage factors. When we start with the wage factors, essentially one of the most important ones is salary. We all want a good salary when we look for work. At some places, they are not paid on salaries, they're paid on hourly wages. Some workers could be paid on hourly wages. Some workers are paid on something which you call piece rate. Now, piece rate essentially basically means, let's say you have a manufacturing company, so a piece rate is used to pay employees based on each unit of output that they produce. And then there is the level of overtime pay. Overtime is basically when a worker works beyond the hours that they're supposed to work and they're paid for it. So you have your overtime pay, you have bonus, which is essentially a reward scheme that is given in order to enhance the productivity of the workers. Then you do have commissions that are paid. Like for example, commissions is basically a percentage of the value of the product that is being sold, which is given as a reward to the employees. This is usually done in work that is related to sales, etc. Then you have profit sharing. So this is another method of rewarding your employees. So it's essentially an additional method like a bonus that's given to employees. So it's a share of the profit which is split apart and given to the employees in a company in order to reward them for their performance. Now let's look at some non-wage factors. So when we look at non-wage factors, obviously you have one really important factor, and that is satisfaction. So the satisfaction that one receives at his job or her job is really important. It is something that motivates them to keep getting up and going to work the next day. And then when we look at the second factor, that could be the type of work that someone does. If someone does a type of work that's really physical, sometimes they may be tired and they may want to choose a different type of occupation. Then you do have your working conditions. Conditions really matter. Your conditions that you work in need to be safe, they need to be secure, and they need to essentially enhance your motivation to work in that place. Then obviously you have the hours that you work. So some people may prefer to work lower hours, some people may be okay to work longer hours. And then you have the holidays. Obviously all of us do want to ensure a good work-life balance, so essentially having good amount of holidays really motivates people to keep working. Then you have things like pensions. So pensions are basically amount of money that is accumulated over time as a reward for the employees that is given to them when they retire. Then as we looked at in one of our previous videos, we have stuff called fringe benefits. Now, some of our parents may have rewards that are given to them, such as a car or a house, which is given. So it's like a non-wage reward that is given to the employees, which is used to motivate them. Then you have something you call the career prospects. Now, this is really important. When you work in a place, you want to ensure that the prospects of your career in the future is better by working in there. So essentially, when the reputation of the place that you work in is better, essentially after that, when you go somewhere else, chances are that you have better prospects. And then there are factors like location that could matter. So the location of a place, some people may prefer the countryside, some people may prefer cities. And then now we'll just look at some factors that can limit people from choosing to work in a place. So you have these as limiting factors. One of the main ones is opportunity costs. What do I mean by opportunity cost? If you remember, the opportunity cost is the cost of the next best alternative foregone. So it's essentially when someone chooses to work in a place, they are giving up on the choice to work in another place. So this could be something that could limit them from going to choose that place. And then you have occupational costs, which can again limit people from going to work there, because choosing that occupation itself comes with a cost. So now we've looked at all the factors that essentially affect someone's choice to go and work. Now let's head into the most fundamental part of this topic, and that is the labor market. Whenever we look at any market, we should understand from now, like we probably know this already, there is a demand and there is a supply. So when we look at labor markets, you have labor demand and labor supply. One of the key things to understand is labor demand comes from the employer's point of view, and labor supply is from the employee's point of view. So I think this is really key to understand. So whenever you look at the word supply of labor, you're thinking from the employee's point of view, and whenever you hear the words demand of labor, you're thinking from the employer's, the person who gives the job, his point of view. So let's try and understand how the graphs essentially look like. So whenever you have this sort of a graph, a diagram, on the right hand side, when you look at labor markets, you have wages rather than price, and on the horizontal axis you have quantity, but quantity of labor. So this is how you label your axes. So whenever we look at the demand for labor, the demand is quite similar to the normal demand curve. You just label it DL, demand of labor. So this basically indicates that wages and demand are inversely related. Yet again, we use the same terminology, inversely related. I want you to try and think as an employer. Let's say someone demands for a really, really high wage. Let's say he demands this wage. Essentially, as you can see here, as you can see here, this is his wage demanded. The wage that you need to offer for the employee. Automatically, one thing that you will notice is when the wage falls, the quantity increases. When the wage rises, the quantity decreases. This shows that they are inversely related. Demand and wages are inversely related. Now, when we look at the demand, there is an important equation that you can use to remember this, to remember the factors that affect the demand for labor. If you remember, we saw a similar equation when we looked at demand and supply for normal goods. So yet again, the demand for labor is a function to what happens to wages rather than prices, and in this Whenever we look at shifts, again, wage is constant when it comes to shifts in the demand for labor. So you have wages as one of the factors, then you have productivity, which is an important factor. The productivity of the labor essentially determines the demand for the labor. And then you have the demand for products. What do I mean by this? So I think it's important that we understand a sort of a chain. Firstly, you have your demand for the product. Whenever you have demand for the product, what happens is it needs to be produced. Production needs to happen. So what do you do to increase production? You employ people. So employment happens. What happens when you have many people employed? Their disposable income rises. So disposable income rises, because of which what happens? Demand rises. This is an important cycle. So this is essentially something you will look at in depth in your A-level course. But I think it's really nice to learn this, to understand this at your GCSE, because one of the key things to know is labor is derived demand. What do I mean by derived demand? Whenever there is high demand for the products produced, there is high demand for the labor to produce the product. Now let's try and look at supply. So whenever we look at supply, let's start off with the diagram for supply of labor. So yet again, you label the curves the same way. You still do have wages and you have quantity of labor on the horizontal axis. But this is really interesting. If you remember, supply is from the employee's point of view. So the supply of labor is essentially a curve that's somewhat like this. Yeah, that is not some sort of a weird shape. It is actually the supply of labor. What does this mean? I want you to try and pause this video and think for yourself before I explain it. What it basically shows is wages and supply are directly related, yes, but to a certain point. So what it means is, so this is essentially what we call a backward bending labor supply, a backward bending. So to a certain point, wages is equals to demand. Like the rise in the wage equals to the rise in the supply. Rise in the supply. So when wages rise, supply of the labor rises, because I want you to try and think as a worker. Let's assume you were going to be paid more wages tomorrow. You'd obviously want to try and work. So, but there's one key caveat here, and that is this part of the diagram. It tends to backward bend over a point of time. Beyond one point, the labor starts to backward bend. What does this mean? This means that beyond a point, workers prioritize leisure over income. So beyond a point, the workers start to prioritize their own well-being over the wages that they are paid. So this is the diagram for the supply of labor. So now let's look at an equation like we looked at. So the supply of labor is yet again equal to wages, which is constant in terms of shifts. And then you have non-wage factors. If you remember, we looked at the beginning of this video. Non-wage factors such as job satisfaction, working conditions, so on and so forth. Then you do have work environment as one key factor. So the environment in which you work in needs to be safe, needs to be secure. And lastly, you have training as a key aspect. So whenever you have training, generally the supply for the labor increases because there's better prospects of labor as soon as you have more training. So now let's look at the factors that determine wages. factors that determine the wage. So the wage is determined again by the intersection of demand and supply. So the factors that determine wages are: number one is obviously the demand and supply. Demand and supply of labor. So those two curves, when they intersect, you find out the wage of the workers. Then you do have something we call bargaining power of the employees. Bargaining power of employees. Now, this is a video that we will see hopefully next week on trade unions. Now, about trade unions, the thing is, I am not sure if it's in the spec, but I definitely think that it's something that we should all know. It talks about the collective power of employees in negotiating better wages, better working conditions, and essentially fighting against their employees to ensure that they are served better. Then you have government policies that affect the wages. So government policies that affect wages could be stuff like minimum wages, which you have NMW, national minimum wages. And then you have the public opinion. So the public opinion over a job generally tends to affect the wage rates. So whenever you have a better public opinion on a job, essentially the wages of the job tend to be higher. Now, this can be seen in the cases of doctors. There's a high regard for doctors socially, so they are paid much greater because they save lives. They have a lot of value to the public, and thus they are paid better. Lastly, the discrimination. So, there is a level of discrimination that could affect the wage rates. So, these are the 5 main factors that determine the wages. So in this video, we have looked at labor markets. If you think this video helped you understand economics better, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join the Econverse. I'll see you again next week with many more videos in the economics library. Bye.